Welcome to the Progressive Women's Leadership Podcast, where our mission is to advance the women's leadership movement in a way that is empowering, supportive, and bold. For today's episode, number 1, we are honored to have Adele Abrams. 3 highlights of this podcast are how mentorship not only helps up-and-coming women, but benefits the mentor, how to respond when you are not being treated as an equal, and how to respond to indirect sexual inequality in the workplace. My name is Mike Brown, and I will be your host. Before we jump in, I would like to provide you with Adele's exceptional background. Adele Abrams is a trailblazer, a role model, a leader. She's worked in a variety of male-dominated industries, navigating through many different challenges. In this podcast, Adele shares some fascinating stories from her work experiences and provides guidance based on those experiences. Adele began her career with a journalism degree. While working in the newspaper industry, she broke into the world of radio at the historic Washington, D.C. radio station, WHFS. At night, Adele continued with her education, getting a law degree. She started working for one of the big national law firms and spent years working in the mining industry. Adele has continued to evolve and is now an attorney, safety professional, and trained mediator who is president of the law office of Adele L. Abrams, P.C. in Beltsville, Maryland, Charleston, West Virginia, and Denver, Colorado, a 10-attorney firm focusing on safety, health, and employment law nationwide. Adele is a certified mine safety professional, and she also provides consultation, safety audits, and training services to MSHA and OSHA-regulated companies. I would now like to introduce Adele.
They're doing a documentary about my old radio station, interestingly enough.
No way.
And I've just been videotaped for that, and that's going to probably be coming out in another year.
What are they doing it for?
Well, because the station was very influential. It was an alternative, freeform, progressive rock station, but it was a commercial station. It wasn't a college station or anything. And we broke a lot of artists. You know, we were one of the only stations that was playing a lot of the music by some fairly big artists. We were one of the early stations playing Springsteen. In fact, a local guitarist friend of mine ended up becoming Springsteen's guitarist, Nils Lofgren. Anyway, a lot of the artists, I mean, everybody from, Little Feat to John Prine to David Bromberg to, I think, Joan Armatrading, Bonnie Raitt, they're all artists that we played quite a bit and who have been interviewed for this documentary. So pretty interesting. Very excited about it coming out. The radio stuff was very interesting. I right out of college, I did work for a commercial top 40 station first, and then about 3 months into that is when I found out that WHFS was looking to hire a woman for an air slot, and so I applied over there, and the rest was history. I was on for 14 years.
Now, were there not a lot of women in that space at the time?
No, I mean, this was 1974. And there were a few people doing radio. You remember Allison Steele, I'm sure, and Carol Miller, who was on WMMR. And they were, people that I emulated, I suppose you would say. But in the D.C. area, they really didn't have any women on any commercial rock stations. There had been a sidekick, Murray the K. You remember Murray the K, right?
I do.
Well, he did a show on WHFS briefly, back when I was still in college, and he had a woman, Judy, who was kind of his sidekick, but she, it was different in the sense that I was running my own board, I was my own announcer, I was picking all my own music, so they had never had a woman doing that before, other than through brokered shows like Murray the K and that kind of thing.
Now, do you think they treated you differently as a woman?
Well, in a sense, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, the real sex discrimination was actually when I went to work for a major network, which I did off air for part of my career before I got into law. And I mean, I went to law school at night, and that's like another whole story. while I was doing mine safety work. But I worked for a network in D.C. It's kind of a long story because I had worked for the Washington Star newspaper. My undergrad degree was in journalism. And so while I was working on radio part-time, I was working for the Washington Star. They closed that newspaper, and I ended up getting a job with this network. And there was a lot of sexual harassment that went on there. And in fact, it's the only time in my life I've ever quit a job without having another job to go to because it was just so pervasive.
Wow. I mean, it was just out in the open what was going on?
Well, they got a new station manager in, and, I probably can't say this during our broadcast, but his first day there, he was, calling people up to his office to meet them. And I came in, and I was in my 20s at that time, and, it was kind of cute, I guess, back then. And, he invited me into his office, and then he closed the door behind me, and then he said, "So, Adele, you're our program promotion director. Well, let me see you shake your tits."
No, he did not.
Yes, he did.
And what year was this?
That actually was in 1982.
Oh, my. So, and at that point is when you quit, or you were there for a little while longer?
Well, I was so shocked, that I somehow found my way out of his office, and I was like, well, that didn't just happen. I hallucinated that. And then I talked to another young woman who was in kind of my same position, but she did the external promotion and I did the internal promotion. And she had like the same experience with him. Then he started, hitting on her and threatening her job if she didn't score him cocaine. And I mean, it was a very dysfunctional place to work. And because I wasn't playing along, with him, on this kind of stuff, all of a sudden, I could tell, the reins were being pulled back on me. I was under a lot more scrutiny, and it was a very untenable place to work. Prior to that, I had more or less gotten along okay. I came under a lot of kidding from the male engineers who were there, who I had to work with as part of doing the internal promotions that I did. But it was almost more like I felt like I was being treated as a mascot, which in itself is somewhat demeaning. I mean, at that point I had an undergrad degree. I was halfway through a master's degree. I had, been a marketing manager at the Washington Star. So I came in with credentials, but I was being treated like, a novelty.
If you were to go back and talk to yourself today in that situation, is there anything you would do differently?
I would say yes. Certainly, I found that it was a comfortable role for me where I wouldn't be harassed, so I played along with it. And I think, I probably would have pushed back a little bit more or a lot more to be taken seriously on merits. I will say it's kind of interesting because one of the guys who used to treat me as a mascot and, joke around and kid me quite a bit, fast forward, 30 years later, after I'm a lawyer, about 2 years ago, he was terminated by this same network. He had ended up working there for all of these years, and he ended up hiring me as an attorney to represent him in his age discrimination action against that same network. So I did get a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory there, I suppose, in the end, because I was able to get a settlement for him, which is why I'm not naming the network, because, there were confidentiality provisions in there. But, I think I would have, tried to put myself in more of a co-equal position. There was a lot of camaraderie, I think, that I missed out on, and a lot of learning opportunities that I missed out on because I was being treated as kind of a sidekick, but I wasn't I wasn't included in a lot of the more serious discussions. Another thing I would have told myself going back is, rather than having kind of kept it a secret and just talking to the other woman who was laterally situated with me, I probably would have taken it to my direct bosses, and I did not do that. I mean, when I ended up quitting, I ended up quitting without giving any real explanation. And, it was that I felt embarrassed. And today I know that the fact that somebody acts in an untoward way toward you does not mean that you've done anything wrong, and there's no reason to feel embarrassed about it. But I have to say, when you think about it, gender discrimination actions were really unheard of in the early 1980s. This was long before you had the Eveleth case, which was the first class action case involving gender discrimination, and that was out of the mines up in the Iron Range. They made that movie North Country about it. That was the very first class action dealing with a hostile work environment. You had quid pro quo discrimination, but even those cases really were not being regularly recognized or brought. And in fact, when I teach employment law at Catholic U, which I continue to do, this is one of the cases that I bring up, just out of my own history with students. When I went to work for an association in 1986 in Washington, D.C., I was newly married at the time. After I was hired, and again, I was at a professional position. I wasn't support staff. I looked in the Employee Handbook, and I was puzzled, and I said to another woman who worked there, I said, I don't see anything in here about maternity leave. And she said, oh, go look at the section called termination. And I said, ha, 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 Paula, that's very funny. And I looked at it, and son of a gun, it said right in the Employee Handbook that at the 7th month of pregnancy, a female employee's employment would be terminated.
That's unbelievable. And this is in the mid-'80s? Is that what you said?
This was 1986, yeah, and it was in the Employee Handbook. Now, I know today that is wholly illegal. And as a matter of practice, I don't think any women who got pregnant, stayed there while this policy was in effect. I think, they left of their own volition or whatever, or at least during the time that I worked there, which was 4 years. But they never changed that policy from the time I started working there until I left 4 years later.
I want to circle back to the camaraderie that you were missing out on, and I think that's common today, maybe not as much as in the past. Can you talk about that a little bit, what you were missing out on?
Well, yes, and I've experienced this in other jobs as well, where I've been kind of the token woman, to put it bluntly, which is that you get included in the formal meetings that go on during the workday, and you get excluded from the less formal networking. You get excluded from the mentoring opportunities. You get excluded from, the relationship development opportunities of going out to lunch, of going out for drinks, back when that used to be a thing after work. It probably is still a thing. It could be a very isolating experience. And, the guys had very strong bonds with each other, because they would go out and, socialize. They would socialize sometimes with their wives and, as couples. I was never really brought into that. I think, in some sense, out of perception that maybe they didn't want their wives meeting the woman that they shared an office with, because back in those days you shared an office. But I've had this continue in other jobs that I've had in the association field, for example. I worked for the Mining Association for 7 years as Director of Government Affairs. And other than for kind of formal business lunches, I can't recall a single time that I had lunch where I was ever invited to lunch by any of the men who were senior staff as well. A couple of times I initiated it and said, let's go grab a sandwich or something. But if I didn't do that outreach, again, it could be a very isolating experience.
Do you think there are women out there today who don't realize that is occurring?
I think so. I think, as you get more women in management positions, there may be, kind of the women's camp of working and mentoring, and the men's camp of networking and mentoring. I don't know that there's still a lot of cross-pollination, and it's interesting because, I'm very involved with the American Society of Safety Engineers, and there's been what they call a common interest group that has formed within ASSE called WISE, which is Women in Safety Engineering. And WISE, has quite a few members now. I think they're up to 1,000 members or so. Again, self-selected within the infrastructure of ASSE, but it was put together precisely for that reason, to enable better networking. They've established a formal mentoring program, and I've participated in that. I've been a mentor. I'm too old to be a mentee at this point. I'm not sure if I'm a tormentor or a dementor, but I've served as a mentor to a few other young women who are coming up in the safety profession now, and one of them even is an attorney who's focusing on safety law similar to what I do, and she's with a firm out in Texas. But, we recognized that within ASSE, it was still largely a male-dominated profession of safety engineering, and that there was a need for there to be an outlet where women could get together and exchange some of these things. And, we just finished the ASSE annual meeting. WISE sponsors a hospitality suite, and, I always make a point to go by there to meet some of the new women who are coming in. I had a great talk in there with a young woman who, it turns out, is the daughter of a safety engineer and is just starting her freshman year at my alma mater, University of Maryland, and wants to go into engineering. And so I was able to have a great conversation with this 18-year-old woman about, different paths that safety can take her in her future, and safety engineering. So those kind of things, really stick with me. That was probably, out of all the conversations I had at a week-long conference, the one that really will stay with me was talking to this young woman and being able to explain to her, just from my own experience, what some of the potential paths are and some of the challenges she can expect and ways to get around those.
So it's an interesting dichotomy. You have these women's groups that are popping up, but they're separate, and it's not creating an environment that allows for the commingling in an effective way. It sounds like the mentoring is more effective in what you're saying, giving guidance on so someone like yourself who have been through these types of things. How important do you think that mentoring is?
Well, I think mentoring can be very critical. I wish I had had more mentors growing up or coming up in my career. At the Washington Star, there was one woman who was one of the VPs in the advertising and marketing department, and I view her as a mentor. She kind of took me under her wing, and it wasn't so much that she told me how to do things or what to do, as much as serving as a role model and showing that it was possible for a woman to attain that level. And she was very supportive. She became somebody I could go to if I had questions about things, that were going on. And that was another environment where there was one of the male VPs who, I don't know if you remember Bill Agee, and there was a woman he was mentoring who he ended up having an affair with.
I do remember that.
Yeah. Well, this was around that same time, and this guy, Danny, who was the head of the advertising department, he was actually above Carol, who was the woman who was kind of mentoring me. He called me in, and he was another one who told me, he found me very attractive and that he thought I was very smart, and he wanted to be my mentor like Bill Agee was to Mary.
Right.
It was all not openly stated, but it was all very implicit because we all knew what that meant back in the day. And, in that situation, I was able to go to Carol and say, Danny just said this, and I'm not really sure what to do. And again, this was like 1980, 1981, and she gave me basically, the confidence to know that I had somebody else I could go to in that department, and that I didn't have to feel coerced into complying, basically, in order to keep my job.
One of the themes I'm hearing from you, and you said it explicitly and implied it a few times, is around mentorship. And it seems that the way you've described it is interesting. When you were talking about the mentor that you had, that it wasn't that she told you what to do or told you how to do it, but it was her actions. And I'm curious if you had some of the folks who will be listening to this, I'm sure will be at a life stage where they have the opportunity to be a mentor. What kind of guidance would you give to folks who want to be a mentor today?
Do it. That first and foremost, that would be it, is just do it. I think women, including myself, who have managed, to get up to higher positions within their industry, should pay it forward, down the line to those who are aspiring to do the same. We can help people avoid making some of the same mistakes we did. People are still going to have their own life experiences, and what works for me isn't necessarily going to work for the other person. But, we can share that. And I find, that when I've worked as a mentor, it's been an enriching experience for myself as well, because I've met some really great people, and, I've learned about some unique challenges that they are facing. I can be thankful sometimes that I haven't been through those challenges.
Are there boundaries that you would recommend creating? Are there certain people that you think would be better candidates for mentees?
Well, I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all. I mean, there's a saying that says if you want to get something done, ask a busy person. You can ask somebody, who is very busy and productive in what they do to be a mentor. If you're somebody who needs a lot of hand-holding, that may not be the right mentor for you. In terms of boundaries, I've had people who've been mentors over the years who I have become friends with, others that in professional situations where the mentorship did not extend out of the workplace. The first person, for example, that I mentioned, she kind of grew into this mentoring role, not just for me, but for other women who work for the Washington Star. And it got to where, sometimes we would all end up going over to Carol's apartment and just doing like a potluck or that kind of thing. So she had found her own way, because she herself, I think, she was the only woman who was in a management position in that entire department at the Washington Star. So I think she got something back out of it by having women that she connected with, even though she was serving as the mentor. It gave her a bit of a support network as well. I'm thinking of another woman at the first association I worked for, and she professionally was a mentor. She told me about good writing. She gave me a lot of pointers. She had been a journalist, but I can't think of a single time, other than my interview, and she was one of the people who interviewed me, when we ever had lunch together. So, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this.
Something interesting you said about the woman at the Star, about what she was doing there, and I'll tie it back to something you had said earlier, that in one of your roles you felt isolated, and that might be, if there are women out there who do feel isolated, that being a mentor can help break through that. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And, in my firm today, I'm the head of the firm, so it's a bit of a weird dynamic, but, several of the attorneys who work for me are women, and, I would like to think that I have a gender neutral firm at this point. 40% of our attorneys are women. But I can still give them some guidance over some of the experiences that I've had. And that's really what it comes down to, is sharing your experience, sharing, the strength that you've built over the years as a professional woman, and giving them some hope that things get better, when they're going through a tough period, and that you have options. I think that's important as well as a mentor, is communicating to women. If you're in a bad spot, you don't have to stay in that bad spot. Don't be afraid sometimes to hold your nose and jump.
So it seems in your career path, you were quite courageous. You were the only women in male-dominated in multiple different organizations, fields. Is that something growing up that you could have seen yourself doing? Is it just how you evolved? How did that all play out?
Well, I was a strange kid. I was an only child, so, I just have to put that out there. I didn't have any brothers that I grew up with. I didn't have any sisters that I grew up with. So I was used to being on my own. I read a hell of a lot. That was my main thing. And listened to music a lot, which, was, again, a big thing, performed music. So that was all very important to me. But just to give you a brief idea, I went to an all-girls Catholic school for 12 years. And so I was never around guys at all. And then at 16, I graduated from high school. Yes, I like I said, I was weird. And I decided I wanted to go to a co-ed school that was non-Catholic and away from home. And I ended up going to University of Maryland. So at 16, all of a sudden I found myself 200 miles away from home housing. I ended up in an off-campus apartment at age 16, hitchhiking to and from school each day. And, I was in business administration initially, then I switched into journalism when they opened the College of Journalism at Maryland. So from my own perspective, it may have been a bit of a detriment for me in terms of how to form relationships. But at the same time, I've certainly learned over the years that the experience I had in terms of the segregation in the workplace, the not being taken seriously in the workplace, the lack of mentorship in the workplace, was not something unique to me because of my background, having, come up from an all-girls school. I did get to meet a lot of guys as friends in college. Some of them I'm still friends with on Facebook, in fact. So I was able to get over that hurdle of having, been kind of in this convent community for 12 years. Which, by the way, I was never religious. It was forced on me by my Irish Catholic mother. But I also hadn't had people telling me that I couldn't do stuff when I was growing up. So I started off, with a clean slate, thinking that anything I wanted to do, I'm smart, I can do. And so it was a real shock to me when I did have pushback or found myself being taken less than seriously. Because my parents always took me very seriously. I was an A student in school. The nuns always took me very seriously. I did well at Maryland in school, so my teachers there took me pretty seriously. But the work world was definitely a shock for me. And really the first thing was getting onto the college radio station. And again, I wasn't the first woman to work at the college radio station by a long shot, but I was the first woman to do a rock and roll show on there. They had women who worked in the news department. I think they had some women who were doing classical shows. So even there, I felt like I was a little bit of a trendsetter. And that was what got me on the path. I mean, I was a journalism major. I took a lot of radio and TV courses once I got, into that part of college. And believe it or not, I had been thinking about going to law school for a long time as well. And I was a late bloomer in that. I didn't start law school until I was like 35. And I did that. I went to law school at night while I was working in mine safety for that association. So 4 years at night. And then I came out, was still working for the association who had supported me in going to law school. And then I had the cold water thrown in my face again, which was when I had been kind of shined on a bit, that with the law school I would be made general counsel because they didn't have one. And after I graduated, I was told by the executive vice president, well, that's really great that you just graduated law school with honors, but, basically we see no reason to change your position or pay you anymore. And, and the executive vice president actually said to me, and I quote, "I don't care how many degrees you get, we'll never have a chick as vice president." And I thought to myself, well, that is a really stupid thing to say to somebody who just graduated from law school. But I stayed with them about another 6 months, and then actually one of the large law firms, of which I knew a couple of partners professionally, they came and recruited me to come and join their law firm in their environment safety and health practice. And at that point, after having, again, the bucket of cold water thrown on me, I felt no real loyalty to stay on with the association at that point. It had really always been my intention to stay in-house and be general counsel. I'm glad that, things changed because I love what I'm doing now, but wasn't something that was, in my game plan.
I want to circle back to something you had said earlier on when you felt that you were treated as a mascot, and you talked about going back and wanting to be a co-equal. What type of guidance would you give to women today in the workplace if they feel like they're not being treated as a co-equal?
Well, that's a tough one. You have to be serious if you want to be taken seriously, I think is one thing. And, the more that I kind of bought into it and joked around and allowed myself to be made fun of or kidded, the more I was perpetuating that. I think, if you come into a job and you've got the necessary skill sets and your skill set match up with everybody else, that should be the basis for your relationships. Obviously, there's going to be people that you are compatible with, who you become friends with, but it should be on an equal footing. It shouldn't be that you're treated as the kid sister all the time, because kid sisters never get the promotions. It's a fine line that you have to walk, and at least in my experience, if you come off too boastful of trying to say, I can do this, I can do that, you'll be seen as obnoxious, so it's being able to show through action your abilities and hopefully being given the opportunity to demonstrate that, rather than just talking about, how great you are or what you can do. Because, boasting doesn't attract a lot of people as friends. I mean, you want to be a worker among workers. You don't want to be greater than, you don't want to be less than necessarily. But I think that women who are treated as the mascots or like the kid sisters, it becomes harder once those roles are delineated to really demonstrate that you've got the chops to do whatever your field is. I don't care if it's accounting, I don't care if it's engineering, I don't care if it's intellectual property work, whatever your forte is, the goal should be to be an equal among equals, not be less than. Of course we all aspire, to get into a higher level. I wouldn't say we all do. A lot of, for myself, I did want to eventually rise to a higher position. The glass ceiling is still out there, though. And to be frank, the reason I revisited my whole idea of going to law school was because my head hurt so damn much from hitting it on the glass ceiling. I had been, at that point, the association I was at was the third one I had worked for. And it became very apparent to me that for a woman with a college education, is equivalent to a man with a high school education. A woman with a master's degree is equivalent to a man with a college degree. And, in order to be lateral with a man with a master's degree, a woman pretty much had to have a law degree.
And that was your motivation for getting the law degree?
In part, like I said, I had been very interested in going to law school previously. I mean, God, growing up, my mother used to tell me you should be a lawyer because I argued all the time. But radio really took priority for me for a long time. And then I went to grad school, and I went for master's in public relations. And it was only after that I took the LSAT. In fact, at that time, that was 1984, because I had just finished up my master's. And more history than you want, probably TMI here, but I was engaged at that time. I did well on the LSAT. We got married, as we had planned to. And then my husband had a real change of heart. He had 2 children. We were kind of fighting for custody of them, and he didn't want me going to law school. And so, like an idiot, I didn't. Well, we got divorced 3 years later. And, I kind of tabled the whole idea of law school, and then it resurfaced, as I said, when I was at that mining association. So I decided to take the LSAT again. I did well on it, and decided just to hold my breath and jump off the cliff. But with my security blanket, which was that I kept my full-time job, and I elected to go to law school at night.
I'm curious about the decision not to go to law school. When you decided, if you look back on it, do you wish you went at that particular time?
My life would have been a whole lot different if I had. I can say that because I had no idea at that point or interest in environment, safety, or health law. I really got into the environment and safety and health area in '86 at that association that fired women when they were 7 months pregnant. Prior to that, I had been working in the government affairs area, and of course, I had been working in media. If I had gone to law school at that time, which would have been, roughly 5 years earlier, it would have been a very different experience for me. I probably would have gone full-time. Who knows what type of law I'd be practicing now. I probably wouldn't be doing webinars. Maybe I would, because that ties in with the radio stuff. But, it's those paths not taken. For me in law school, in a way, I was glad that I was going part-time because it helped me keep one foot in reality. I wasn't one of those law students who, get the first B they ever got in their entire academic career and then jump off a balcony. I realized there was more to life than that because I was a little bit more mature. I made some good friendships in law school because we were all a bit older in the evening program. And so, it was a more varied group. It's really hard to say. The hard part was when I went to work for the big firm after I left the association as a newly minted attorney. And at that point, I was, 40 years old. I had no peer group. And I think that's probably one reason why ultimately I ended up starting my own firm, which now we've grown to 10 attorneys. But age-wise, I was the peer group of the partners. But, grade-wise, I was in with all the first-year associates who, for the most part, were 25 years old. So we had a 15-year age gap between me and my peer group, the way the firm was structured. And that was another place that, again, a lot of sexual harassment going on. And this time it was a different experience because I was older, so I was kind of immune from that. And I was the one that everybody was coming to going, I can't believe that this partner just told me, I'm going on this trip with him and I better be prepared to sleep with him, some of the secretaries became friends of mine. There was one secretary who was going through a divorce and her husband wasn't paying any support for the kids and she was really in a bad spot. One of the partners in my practice group came back to her. He was a little drunk after lunch, which was not an unusual thing there. And he said, I heard you're having some money problems. And she said, well, that's true. And he took a $100 bill out and dangled it in front of her and said, well, this is yours if you me.
No.
Yeah.
And this was in the early 90s?
That would have been actually around 1999.
99?
Or possibly 2000, yeah.
Oh, my.
There was another law clerk who worked for the firm who was put in one of these quandaries where she went on a road trip with one of the partners. He made overtures to her. She declined. And then he came back, told everybody she had slept with him anyway. And then when she graduated law school, because she was going to law school at the time, he blackballed her when she applied for a job at the firm.
Wow. And this is just 15 years ago.
Yeah. It was pretty rough. I mean, again, I was remarried by that time, by the time I finished law school. And people were generally leaving me alone. I mean, like leaving me alone for good and for bad. As I said, it was a fairly isolating experience for me. And they had a women's law lunch group that would meet once a month. And it was the most bizarre thing because, again, the women partners who participated in it, I would have expected to be serving as mentors, and it almost seemed like the opposite thing where they were trying to convince the young women associates to go on the mommy track and not try to go for partnership. Were they doing that because they felt they had made a mistake? It was never really put out that way. It was more, this is better for you. It was I won't say paternalistic, but more of a maternalistic thing that, it's going to be too much of a stress for you to try to be a partner if you're planning to have kids. And so this is really a better option for you. And I can tell you, I mean, in the 5 years I was at that firm and in the years that I've kept track of things since then, of course, my whole practice group has left that firm now, which is another story. But there was not a single woman from my practice group who made partner either before me or after me. And that was one reason why I quit, was I was bringing in a lot of business and I could see the writing on the wall that, I was going to be 50 because it was a 10-year partner track by the time I came up. And it was hard enough for women, much less older women. Wow. I mean, the culture of that firm is unbelievable. Do you think that was the norm for firms? Do you think yours was, like, if you on a scale, was from 0 to 10, they were a 10 or that was a 5? That was what was going on all over the place. They were probably among big firms. Let me say, I've heard similar tales. The culture at this particular firm, I think, tended to encourage it. It was kind of a hard drinking firm. And, whenever you have people who are in power who are also drunk on the job, that's never a good combination. And I don't drink. So, I was a fish out of water on that whole thing. That was even used against me. In fact, at one point was that, you won't go out and drink with clients. And I don't drink. I'll go out with clients and I'll have a Coca-Cola, but yeah. And I hate to even say this, but initially when I was hired, I really got the sense when I had one of these exchanges with one of the partners about the fact that I hadn't, gotten wild and crazy with one of the clients when they sent me out on the road. I hate to say it this way, but I really got the sense that he had been trying to pimp me out. And that was when I was 40. But, I made it real clear that, that wasn't going down. And I will say, because I was good at what I did, I don't think that in that firm, it hurt me professionally in that regard. But I think they had it in their mind that, I was somebody they were going to use to entice new clients in. I'll just leave it that way. And not necessarily for meritorious reasons.
I wonder if, 15 years later, if that culture is still, to what extent that culture still exists.
Well, I'd like to think that it had changed.
I think it had, with everything going on with social media, everything, it just seems like it's had to improve a little bit. It's hard, I'm not in the legal space, so I don't really know, but I'm shocked at what you're saying 15 years ago. So maybe not.
There's still going to be some quid pro quo sex discrimination going on. There's still going to be hostile work environments. There's still a lot of large firms that are mostly the boys' clubs, and there's still, I think, a certain tokenism that we see. If you look at the numbers, the percentage of female partners at law firms is still quite a bit lower than the male partners. We have not adjusted that over the past 15 years.
And from what I hear, the investment banking industry is similar.
Yeah, and those were some of the initial groundbreaking cases on sex discrimination. You had Waterhouse versus Hopkins and cases like that, where Ms. Hopkins was not given a partnership role at Waterhouse because she didn't dress femininely enough, and she needed to go to charm school and have a makeover. These were all things that were put in the partners' reasons why they were denying her partnership. And she ended up winning that case. That was, a fairly significant one. But, things are changing, but it's a long, slow process. And, it wasn't things that they would never think of doing to men, they still do to women or try to. The Johnson Controls Supreme Court case, which again, only goes back 20 years now, something like that, to work for them in this area where toxic chemicals were being used, women had to agree to be sterilized, and yet they had no comparable provisions for men because they didn't want the risk of having two-headed babies being born, and they kind of ignored the scientific data that men's sperm could be affected by the mutagens that were in the chemicals that they were using in the workplace.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But, the fact that case had to go all the way to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to say, no, this violates Title VII.
So we're getting to the end of our time, and I just wanted to know if there's anything else you'd wanted to share, advice for women out there, something we haven't touched upon?
Be kind to each other. I've encountered over the years situations where women feel like their competitor in the workplace is the other women in the workplace, and that there's only room for one queen bee or for one token woman at a particular level in an association or in an organization. We can support each other, and women can rise, as a whole in the workplace, or we can have competition, in which case everybody ends up losing a little bit. That's really be kind to one another, be supportive of one another. It's not a zero-sum game that if another woman achieves something, that means you've lost something. And I think sometimes, I don't know if it stems from competition, for boyfriends, going back to high school days or whatever, but we have to stop looking at other women as our competition and looking at them as resources. That's
great guidance. Well, Adele, I want to thank you for your time. This was amazing. You shared some great stories, and I think there's a lot of guidance out there for everyone. And the time flew.
Yep. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time with me on this.
Will do. Enjoy the rest of your vacation, Adele.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. For more information like this, please go to progressivewomensleadership.com. Have a great day.